I'm Jennifer Byrne, and welcome to the club. We have two books dripping with angst and urban alienation tonight, laced with humour and alcohol to soften the mix. The first is Indelible Ink by Fiona McGregor, a book which has had the critics all a Twitter and which we were keen to have a good look at for ourselves. And our classic tonight, well, why don't you see if you can guess? It's a book about a teenager. It's one of the most famous titles of modern times. The author, a very mysterious, solitary guy, died earlier this year. It's never been out of print, and when first published in 1951, this is what they said. Once in a blue moon, there appears on the American literary scene a young voice so articulate, so understanding, so full of humour, love and pity that jaded book reviewers must stop dead in their tracks and rejoice. That's what we're talking about on the show very shortly, but let's get started. Introducing, as ever, my friends Marique Hardy and Jason Steger. Now, our first guest tonight is a repeat offender, this being his second time in the club. We all know him as a playwright, an actor, a screenwriter, but next month, the busiest bloke in the country sees the release of his first novel, How It Feels. Please welcome back Brendan Cowell. Our second guest is an award-winning journalist and presenter who went on to serve for more than 7 years as a Victorian government minister, and this year released her first book, the moving and revealing memoir, Public Life, Private Grief. Please welcome her to the club, Mary Delahunty. Okay, Brendan, this book that made the critics rejoice?
Yes, look, it's quite arrogant to choose this book because there's been so much said about it, but I think it's important just to look at it as a book, really. I read this book first read this book at university when I was 20 years old, and it absolutely was the life-changing book. It just opened my mind up to, a way of looking at the world and his character. And I think, interestingly enough, since Catcher in the Rye, that style of character, the angsty kid against the world who can't find his place, has become very familiar. But I think at that time it was a relatively new character in a lot of ways. And I guess after reading that book in 1996, Holden Caulfield talks about characters that are phony. He doesn't believe in most of the people he meets. That he calls them phony, and he goes on to explain. Crummy or phony. And the thing I loved most about it when I was writing my book, why I studied it, is because I just love the first-person narrative. He talks direct to the reader about his experiences and often says, I wish you were there. You wouldn't believe it. It was unbelievable. I wish you were there. And he kind of just involves you in his experience. So when it does become quite dark, or he becomes quite bleak or cynical against humanity, you're kind of with him because of the way he's addressing you. And
we'll come back because I know you could go on for the next 15 minutes.
I just want to make one more point. After reading about all this phoniness, after that day, pretty much all the work I have made or all the behaviours in my life, I've wondered whether Holden Caulfield would think I'm phony. I have kind of lived by that rule of thinking...
He's on your shoulder.
He's on my shoulder. That's why it changed my life, because I've always thought, I'm about to do this. I wonder what Holden Caulfield will think, So
let's talk a bit more about...
There's probably a psychological disorder for that. Caulfieldism.
Let's talk about old Holden, as he calls it when he likes old Phoebe, old Holden.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Holden Caulfield.
I still fall in love with men like Holden Caulfield. That, he's just this eccentric, self-absorbed, misanthropic, questioning the world. I love his voice. I, loved him as a teenager, and I'm a little bit old for him now. I'm sort of jailbait now, but I read
your Joyce Maynard.
I read it a lot when I was a teenager, and again in my early 20s, and probably haven't picked it up since then.
Did you still love him?
Yeah, absolutely. It's word perfect, I think. But a lot more of the sadness came through than I'd ever. I really felt my heart broke for him a lot more than it ever had.
I haven't read it for a very long time, and I tired a little bit of his voice, actually. And because the style is so sort of strong, And the language, he goes over using all those terms. I mean, what does he say? Phony, old, goddamn, and all.
It killed me. I got to tell you, this really is like
gorgeous.
If you want to know the truth.
If you want to know the truth,
that's the sort of key, isn't it? And if you want to know the truth, we're getting it from Holden. We're getting Holden's truth. I found the style eventually sort of started to grate a little bit with me. And
drove me nuts.
I got a bit tired of it.
You're both wrong.
Hang on.
It doesn't mean it's wrong. Doesn't have to be a great book. It's just it wears you down after a while.
I think the mark of that sort of writing is that you instantly want to write and talk like that.
That's,
you leave that book wanting to write.
Do you know what I
do?
I went back and read the crits of the time, and it was astonishing how many of them, thinking they were original until it all came out, that all of them wrote in this style. Immediately they picked it up, and everyone was writing their reviews.
It's absolutely intoxicating.
In this kind of hipster, ultra honest, but sort of personal, intimate.
I mean, because the first time you read it, it does have that sort of huge impact, doesn't it? And I think inevitably, when you read it again, it doesn't. Unfortunately, and as I say, I sort of tired of the style, but that doesn't mean I don't admire the book.
But you got sick of Holden, you said. You got sick of him.
I got a little bit sick of him, yeah.
Well, I first met Holden, when I was studying the canon, and so you came out of Shakespeare and Dickens and thee, thou and thou, and suddenly you ran into goddamn all. And I loved it. I loved it because suddenly there was this sense of stream of consciousness. Rereading it, I now think of Steve Toltz, actually, and I think of how much it changed literature. But I also see the poignancy in it, and I now understand what Catcher in the Rye was about. I simply didn't understand it when I first read it. What was the metaphor about Catcher in the Rye? And here's this, 16, 17-year-old kid so full of pain and not able to find someone who can actually love him, that he wants to love all these other, lost kids. And that little sequence where he talks about, I want to look after all these kids in the Rye.
Stop them falling over the cliff.
I want to stop them falling over the cliff. Now, I missed that completely when I read it, So it's the mark of a classic, isn't it, that you can return to a book and yes, say, OK, that style now is a bit old hat and it's a bit well used and it can be effective, but there is something much deeper.
Also, I thought you think not much is happening, because basically he has a bad time at Pensy Prep and then he has 2 days wandering around, New York. But that style you're talking about, where it was so direct, it doesn't come across as like flashbacks as it would in a third person. Yeah. It's just him chatting to you. Yeah. Well, this reminds me of when...
He tells you a story about when he saw a movie and, and what the actors were like and...
when he goes to the Natural History Museum and what he loves is that the Eskimo is still there catching the fish and the deer is still there at the lake.
And you change, that never changes, you change.
And you feel that yearning. I want to be safe. I want to be secure. I want things not to slip from
Absolutely.
me.
I found, we were talking about how it can be abrasive, the voice, and I found a new tenderness in the book. I mean, that lovely conversation he keeps wanting to have with people he has with the cab driver of, does anyone know where the ducks go in winter when the lake freezes over? And he keeps just asking random people. Yeah. And it's, whether it's an intentional metaphor or not, he is in a cold world and he is trying to find somewhere to go. But it was a beautiful conversation. And if anything, that's all he was trying to do, he's trying to connect with people. And look, he's a wild and kind of acute observer, almost painfully and almost to his own demise because he pushes people away. But there's tenderness in observation, and I think with his wisdom and his genius, it's kind of crippled him. He can't really be in the world, which inevitably Salinger couldn't be in the world after the book became so big. And the truth is he continued to write every day, and there are many unpublished manuscripts, but he just didn't like the publishing business. He didn't like what happened to his family and friends, not only the critics, and the thing he hated the most was how people could criticise your characters. He didn't mind saying whether it was a good book or not.
Like we've just done with Fiona.
Yeah, just like that.
He said, how dare you murder my characters? And he hated that, and he said publishing was the worst business. He'd rather spend 2 hours at the dentist than a minute you know, in the publishing business.
So where are all these scripts? That's what I'm excited
Well, he's
about. And who's going to have copyright of them? And who's going to fight over them? Is it going to be like Kafka, you know, over there in Berlin? And of course, Israel wants all his old manuscripts. Who's going to fight over Salinger's? We haven't even seen
anyone
them.
with the remotest chance of getting them, I suspect.
I would be very sure he burnt them all. I mean, he has so much...
Why would you think
he wrote to write. He wrote to write by the end.
But he never... I mean,
sure?
I read one interview that he gave in the 70s or something, and he said he didn't know whether they would be published posthumously. In a way, you'd have sort of hope that you'd hope that he stuck to his guns and burned the whole.
He did write Finding Zooey, and I mean there were other books. It was just this one totally overshadowed. And that's the club for another month. A big thanks to tonight's book clubbers. Thank you so much, Brendan, Marique, Jason, and Mary. Thank you. Now, next month, well, I know we said that we'd do it in summer or early next year, but we just can't wait a minute longer to look at the book everyone's talking about, Jonathan Franzen's Freedom. So that will be on our agenda, plus my choice for the club, Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. It's a monster. It's contentious. It has formed a whole stream of social and economic philosophy, and it's back on top of the bestseller lists in America after 50 years since it was published, largely thanks to the Tea Party movement. Anyway, it's also worth having a look at before it gets ruined by Hollywood, because there is a film on the way. So there you go. 2 big, fat books. Look happy, you guys. I hope you'll have a go at least some of them. And until next month, very happy reading. Good night.